investigate my investigators. I mean, that was just staggering. People don't typically have the right to demand that the police investigate somebody. And they don't acquire that right simply by being President of the United States, unless the President is a king and is above the law. Kleptocracy on steroids, that's going on all the time. His whole family, they try to track our policy with respect to particular countries, like Qatar or Iran. There's just too much to be a coincidence. Qatar says to Jared Kushner, we're not going to bail you out of this idiotic $1.6 or $1.3 billion investment at 666 Fifth Avenue. And suddenly we start siding with the Saudis on the blockade of the Qataris. And then they turn around and say, yeah, maybe Jared will help you after all. And suddenly the president says, that blockade wasn't so bad. I mean, there are thousands of examples that show that this president is using the office to enhance his wealth. And it's not that I'm particularly jealous of his wealth, it's that I think that the president is supposed to be, last time I looked, preserving the interests of the United States and not the interests of the Trump organization. And when the policies of the United States on Ukraine, on the Magnitsky Act, on sanctions against various countries, track not the interests of this country, but the interests of this guy who is infinitely greedy, then we really have a problem. I could go on and on, but I won't. As long as Rosenstein is in place, and Mueller and the Southern District of New York are pursuing the truth, the downside of pursuing impeachment may well exceed the upside. It's a close question. Our book is about navigating the shoals between Scylla and Charybdis. No matter what we do, I mean, put this guy in power, we're screwed. But I think we'll survive. We've endured other crises before. We've endured the Civil War of a different country, a better one after it. If we endure this period, we will, I think, be a different country. But will we be better or worse? Will we have learned our lesson? Never again to elect someone like this, perhaps to get around the Electoral College, or will we have gotten so used to this kind of collapse of democratic institutions that it will seem easier the next time around? That would be a great tragedy. Anyway, if you want to learn more about this and get a signed copy of the book, after the Q&A period, I invite you to get a book, and I'd be happy to sign it, and Joshua would as well. Thanks very much, and now the person on whom I've loaded all of this, Joshua.
Terrible expectations. I wore my best Superman shirt for the occasion. I was told before I got up here by the guy who owns the bookstore that our main goal is to persuade you all to buy books. It's not obvious to me that that is my main goal, but I just thought I would let you all know that we would be grateful if you would buy them, because I think they're pretty good, and they'll give you a much better sense of what we think than just this conversation here. So hopefully this is a chance to just give you the big picture and where we're coming from. And I want to start right now by saying I'm not going to talk very much about Trump over the next 5 to 10 minutes. I suspect many of you would love to talk about him. I suspect many of you would be interested in hating on him and sort of me going on about all the ways in which he's acting terribly and illegally. And I think he is doing those things. I just want to step back and talk a bit more about the book and where we're coming from. And then in the Q&A, we'd be happy to dive more into current events and how we see the book relating to that. Because for me, in coming to the book, Larry had approached me. He had this idea, so impeachment. I think it's going to be big, and he was right, as he usually is. And he said, I think I want to write a book about impeachment that has something to do with this administration. And my very first question is, and on what planet are you going to publish a book on this administration that isn't outdated within 3 months? Tell me how that looks. And so we had a long conversation, and one of the big questions that we really agreed was important is how do you describe this constitutional power, its legal dimensions, its historical and political dimensions, in a way that is relevant today, but that will also be relevant in 5 years and in 10. And that offers a framework for how to think about this that people with different beliefs can apply to their own circumstances. And ultimately, that is what we aimed to do. And for me in particular, the question that animated the book was, let's imagine that you think this guy is a bastard. Let's imagine that you think he is terrible, that he's breaking the law, that he's breaking norms, that he's violating core premises of American democracy. And let's imagine that 40% of the country wants to impeach him and 60% doesn't, which is the world in which we find ourselves. What do you do next? Loading public discourse with impeachment talk and, calling for that extreme remedy right off the bat and mobilizing an entire movement around that idea may or may not be the best way to deal with the president who you believe is out of control. And so it seemed to me that the real question is, how do you build a political consensus necessary to thwart the president? And once that exists, what kind of a conversation do you have about the appropriate response to wrongdoing? And is calling for impeachment the best rhetorical strategy, the best political strategy for getting the country to a place where it can really deal with the damage this guy is doing? And so, if you were going to approach it that way, we thought that there are basically 6 questions you have to ask. And those are the 6 questions that structure our book. And I'll just very quickly run through it. This will be the rough equivalent of me summarizing the preface, but the preface is far more articulate than I am, so I encourage you to take a look at that. The first chapter is, what is this power? Why does it exist? Why did the framers put it here? And in telling that story, we start with Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, who got up and he said, you guys, we have a real problem here. We're creating this new powerful federal government and this new position, a president. But historically, when powerful leaders of powerful governments got out of control, there was basically only one thing to do about it, and that was assassination. How do we avoid a historical pattern of coup and revolution and assassination as the way that countries deal with leaders who go off the rails? And he had an idea. He said, there's this English doctrine of impeachment. It was centuries old. It had basically fallen into disuse in England, but it had been received into the colonies. And he said, I think we can do something with this. I think we can make it work for us. Obviously, we're going to have to make some changes. In England, you could not impeach the king. That would be in some tension with the idea that the king was above the law and was chosen by God. And by some tension, I mean, obviously you couldn't do that. And also, there was this question of what is the standard for impeachable conduct going to be, and what is the manner in which we're going to do it. And those are questions the framers very quickly realized they have to grapple with. But the first and most basic question they had to decide was whether to include an impeachment power in the Constitution. And it may seem obvious to us that you would want to do that, but quite a few framers didn't think it was obvious at all. And in the first chapter, we chart the history of the impeachment power, the manner in which it was Americanized, the way in which they constructed it, and the debates that the framers had among themselves over whether we should have it and why we should have it, and what kinds of presidential wrongdoing in particular might evoke the need to activate it. And we offer that not because we think that the framers' word is final. In fact, Larry and I think very much the opposite. The Constitution belongs to the living. But understanding the original plan can at least offer us guidance in thinking about how is this power meant to relate to the broader system of checks and balances, and under what circumstances should we use it. And in the rest of Chapter 1, we walk through a number of impeachment efforts in history, including that against President Tyler, who was nearly impeached in the 1840s for vetoing a ton of bills that Whigs in Congress passed, and they just lost their minds and were like, we have to get rid of this guy. And their impeachment effort failed, although narrowly. We then talk about Nixon and Clinton, and try to extract from these a few basic principles, many of which Larry identified. And those principles are roughly as follows. You can impeach the president for every unconstitutional act, because, as Larry pointed out, that would create overwhelming, crushing pressure on the constitutional system, which leaves many difficult questions unanswered, and forces us to find answers in our own time. Moreover, you can't just look to the constitutional hardware, as it were. You also have to look to the software. What are the norms that define acceptable governance? What are the norms that give us an understanding of what it means to be the president of a democracy? And if a president violates those, that may well constitute grounds for impeachment, that you have to look to the full scope of the threat that the president's behavior poses to the country. And finally, we warn that you can't have partisan impeachments, and they're the Clinton cases, the lodestone, but you also don't want to set the bar too high. There's a temptation to say, well, Watergate was such an easy case. That is sort of the canonical picture of impeachment. But the framers knew that threats to the republic could come in many forms. They could come from crooks or kleptocrats. They could come from high-functioning morons. And in any number of circumstances, you need to be ready to deal with a president who is unwilling to abide the constitutional system. So that leads us to the second chapter, to what is often presented as the only question. And I'm sure you've all seen 1,000 articles of the following form. The president has or has not committed a high crime or misdemeanor. Insert Madison quote here. Therefore, he must or must not be impeached. End of story. Right? The usual way in which impeachment is talked about reduces the entire thing to a single question. Is what the president did a high crime or misdemeanor? If so, the sword of Damocles has to fall, the trigger has to go out with the president, and that's the only question worth asking. We think that that is the exact wrong way to think about impeachment. The question whether the president has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes, misdemeanors, and therefore has made impeachment constitutionally permissible, is not the same thing as knowing whether the Constitution is wise, or prudent, or even possible. But nonetheless, it's important to know. What is a high crime and misdemeanor? Under what circumstances is impeachment constitutionally allowed? And we talk at some length about that question. A lot of folks like to say, as Gerald Ford did during an effort under the Nixon administration to impeach Justice Douglas, that high crimes and misdemeanors just mean whatever the House says they mean. And that's true in the most uninteresting, cynical sense. One that doesn't care about constitutional structure and in which Congress can impeach for any arbitrary reason that strikes its fancy. But we contend in the book that you can draw on constitutional text and principle and structure and lessons of American history to give content to this idea. And it's not that impeachable offenses are only things that are federal crimes. It's not that a pattern of conduct can amount to impeachment. These are 2 points that have been widely disputed, and we think the answer is pretty clear, and we explain why. The bottom line is impeachable conduct occurs when the president abuses his power or otherwise acts in a manner that makes him unviable as the leader of a country that is a democracy. Is he using his power corruptly or tyrannically, or is he otherwise engaged in conduct that really makes it unthinkable that we will persist at a shared democratic project together with that individual at the helm? And to go on knowing that we allowed someone who did those things to continue to exercise that kind of power. And so we talk at great length about the meaning of bribery and treason and how they can inform the meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors, and offer some really wonderful historical examples, one of which I'll just briefly note here. I assume that many of you have seen or heard of Hamilton, the absolutely awesome Lin-Manuel Miranda musical. Now, it's kind of, the musical ends where, I mean, no spoilers, but like this was it was a while ago. So the musical ends where Burr has killed, Vice President Burr has killed former Treasury Secretary Hamilton, and everyone is sad and they cry, and then the curtain closes. And you think, like, golly, that was really moving. What happened next? The Vice President of the United States just straight up murdered somebody, who also happened to be a framer and a former Treasury Secretary. Could you imagine if Mike Pence shot and killed Scott Mnuchin? And everyone was just like, oh, okay. Like, dueling happens. I guess it's tough out there in Washington. Or in that case, it can be Hawking, New Jersey, which may still be rough, I don't know. So, as we point out, Burr was never impeached. And not only was he not impeached, but when charges were issued against him for murder in New York and New Jersey, a number of senators wrote to the governors of those states and said, we would be most grateful if you would drop the charges, because this is enormously embarrassing to us, the Senate, because the Vice President is also the President of the Senate, And it looks terrible for him to have these indictments hanging over his head. And so the charges were dropped, and then it gets even weirder. After the charges are dropped, Burr returns to the Senate to preside over the partisan impeachment of Justice Salmon, creating, as one commentator at the time remarked, an unusual scenario in which the murderer was not arraigned before the judge, but the judge was arraigned before the murderer. And so here you have a circumstance in which the clearest possible crime is committed. And yet not only does the Senate not impeach, it begs these states to drop their indictments and doesn't even consider the possibility of impeachment. And we use that story to motivate a much broader explanation of the relationship between impeachments and crimes, the bottom line of which is that not all crimes are impeachable, and not all impeachable offenses are crimes, and ultimately we can't escape responsibility for judgment. That ultimately what the Constitution asks from us is judgment. Is this the kind of conduct that makes this person unviable as the leader of a democracy? And who exactly is it that makes that determination? Well, here we arrive in the third chapter, Congress. It's Congress that ultimately makes this determination. And there are many, many implications of this. The first of which we think has been drastically underappreciated, is that Congress, in addition to having the power to impeach, has the power not to impeach. That nowhere does the Constitution establish the House or the Senate as a roving commission to smite all wrongdoers. There is no deus ex machina clause in the Constitution. Congress, as in so many other areas, has the discretion, and in particular the House has the discretion, to decide should we come after the president. And that discretion operates at every level of the process. It operates at figuring out whether to investigate, whether to use the I word in public, whether to form a special committee to investigate, whether to authorize that committee to consider articles of impeachment, all the way up to a final House vote on whether to actually impeach the guy. And then, of course, the discretion flows to the Senate. And there have been senators in U.S. history, including Senator Robert Byrd in the Clinton impeachment, who said, I believe that he is guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors alleged, and I will nonetheless vote to acquit, because I don't think impeachment is in the greater interest of the Republic. So Congress enjoys extraordinary discretion in deciding whether and when and how to investigate conduct that may be impeachable, to bring it to the public's attention, to go after the president. Congress, of course, doesn't just have the impeachment power. It can censure the president, it can use the power of taxation of the purse, it can pass laws, it can investigate, it can engage in oversight. Congress has an arsenal of tools that allow it to respond to a president who's out of control. Impeachment is the biggest and most powerful, but also the most dangerous of them. So in thinking about what Congress should do in the face of presidential wrongdoing, the question isn't just, did Madison somewhere say that conduct sort of like this is a high crime or misdemeanor? The question is, what is the right move to save our democracy in the face of what the president has done here? And Congress has to make that decision, and it has lots of tools available to it, and it has to choose among them. And in the third chapter, not only do we describe those tools, but we offer a general framework. And I actually personally think this is one of the most interesting parts of the book, although, of course, it's all great. But in this part of the book, we divide it up and we say, what are the risks of impeaching too soon? What are the risks of impeaching too late, or not at all? And what risks are unavoidable, even if you get it exactly right? And we really try to offer a comprehensive framework of all of the things that you ought to think about in deciding whether and when to pull that trigger. This leads us to the fourth chapter, where we go deeper into the halls of Congress. We're a little obsessed with Congress because usually when people write about impeachment, they just say, like, legal scholars are like, oh, we're really good at interpreting what high crimes and misdemeanors are, and the rest is politics. And they dismiss politics as though it's uninteresting. Well, we don't quite see it that way, / we think that's an exceptionally stupid way to write about it. And so we really take that seriously. And in chapter 4, go deep into the halls of Congress. The Constitution doesn't tell Congress how to do an impeachment. It doesn't tell it what the process is, except with the barest of outlines. It doesn't really explain how things should work, what the burden of proof should be, whether witnesses should be allowed, whether lawyers should be allowed. All these very important questions that can define what an impeachment really looks like. So in chapter 4, we return to the Constitutional Convention and we ask, why did the framers give this to Congress? They carefully considered giving it to the Supreme Court. They also considered giving it to a council of all state governors, to a council of all state legislatures, and to a council of all of the highest justices of each state Supreme Court. Like, they left no stone unturned. Every branch of government that exists in the Constitution at one point in the convention wielded the impeachment power. And they ended up giving it to Congress, but then splitting it and giving half of it to the House and half of it to the Senate. Why did they do that? I will not tell you, but it's in the book. It's in the book. And I promise you it's very interesting. And then they imposed a supermajority voting requirement in the Senate, which was almost unprecedented in the history of Western constitutionalism. But they did it there, and in a number of other places, including the 25th Amendment, foreshadowing. They did it in the 25th Amendment because this was the kind of thing that they needed to be damn sure the country had fought hard about. There needed to be deliberation, and there needed to be some level of consensus. And so going from there in Chapter 4, we describe in detail how an impeachment works, how it starts, what the process is, what every stage of it looks like, what factors Congress historically has and hasn't considered significant, and we end by looking at all of the major impeachment efforts in history and giving a general account of what factors tend to make it more likely that Congress will impeach and won't impeach. And obviously that may be of some interest to those of you trying to figure out those odds today. That leads us to Chapter 5, and I'll move very quickly so we have lots of time for Q&A. In Chapter 5, we do something a little different. We step way back and we ask, why is it that there is so much darn impeachment talk in modern American politics? It's easy to take for granted. I kind of did. I'm like young enough that I can, like my entire life in politics, we've talked about impeachment. When I first told my grandparents that I was writing this book, one of them said to me, it's the funniest thing.